All right, welcome to Minding the Brain Live. We've got some questions here, and we will try to answer them. The first one is, what's the most surprising aspect of neuroscience you uncovered through the podcast? And how has it changed your perspective on the human brain?
And so I would say, because I'm the one typically being interviewed, nothing has come as a surprise to me. So I'm going to leave this one for Jim to answer.
Yeah, Jim doesn't know as much about the brain. So one thing that I learned is that addiction, which is Kim's specialty, has a particular neural signature that you can differentiate from other kinds of wants and desires, which sort of helps reify addiction as a real thing. And it can be, by looking at how brains function, you can actually distinguish addictions from more mundane kind of wants. And I thought that was very interesting, something I didn't know and wouldn't have guessed.
So there you go. So the next question is, are there any questions about the brain do you think we'll never find answers to? So I'm going to answer this by going back to when I was an undergraduate and learning about simple brain processes of learning about sensation and perception. And I remember being in my second year sensory perception neuroscience class, and my professor saying, we understand how signals get from the external world into our brain. So we know how visual information gets processed by our optic nerve and gets up into the regions of our brain that process visual information. We understand how smell gets up there, touch, taste, etc. But what we don't understand is how it all gets packaged together to create our sensory whole. So the fact that I'm looking at an audience today of several faces, recognizing some of you, right? That recognition of a face. I'm able to also feel my body as it's sitting on a chair. I can smell the Subway sandwiches. Thank you, Subway. If you want to sponsor us, give us a call. But how that's all put together to create that reality, I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever figure that out, because it seems like we've got all these bits of information that is then translated into trillions of bits of processing. So that's what I think, but Jim's skeptical of that.
Yeah, I think we might figure it out. I also want to say that eventually, but I think it's really interesting how some aspects of our sensory world seem to be more bound together than others. So everybody can imagine what a dog looks like barking without hearing it, and everyone can imagine the sound of a dog barking without seeing it. So when you see a dog barking, it's sort of integrated, but you can sort of imagine how they're different. But what's weird is that when you look at like a mug like this, there's a completely different part of your brain that knows it's a mug than knows where it is. But that feels really integrated. Like even within the visual area, we've got like the object identification is down below and the location is up above, and you can get disorders that disrupt one or the other. So you can get people who say, I know there's something there, but I don't know what it is. And you have other people saying, I know there's a mug, but I can't tell you where it is. So it's the whole idea of integration is not, it varies even, right? So anyway, these are great questions. I have my idea of what neuroscience will never do. And this is that I don't think that neuroscience will ever be able to just pick a random person and be able to tell what they're thinking or look at their brain and read what their memories mean. And I think that because I believe that everybody's brains develop in a semi-random way, based on some very vague instructions from your genes, right? The genes for your brain are only about 100 megabytes, which you could fit on a DVD, but you have trillions of connections. So there's a lot of just generative processes. And so when somebody learns one fact and another person learns the same fact, I strongly suspect that those facts are represented so differently in the different brains that you couldn't make a machine that wasn't trained on a specific person and be able to tell like what they're thinking or what their memories are. So that's my thought.
So the next one is for me. So someone's asking, I heard that psilocybin can help people overcome addictions by getting the dorsal mode network, so the DMN, where this audience will know what that is, so we'll have to explain what that is too. The default mode network. Oh. So perhaps our listeners not here today might not know that, but psilocybin might get the default mode network out of its stuck state or something like that. What does the research say about the role of magic mushrooms in addiction recovery? So let's take these few concepts apart. So psilocybin is the main active ingredient in what is called the magic mushroom, right? So certain species of fungi can make us feel awesome and hallucinate. Others will kill us, and yet others are delicious, and we eat them. But the specific form of these mushrooms have psilocybin, which is actually metabolized into something called psilocin. And psilocin, once it is absorbed, gets into the bloodstream, goes up into the brain, it actually acts on a very specific receptor in the human brain called the 5-HT2C receptor. Or is it 2A? My apologies. 5-HT2A receptor. And this receptor normally binds serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter in the human brain that is involved with a ton of things, including mood, sleep, sexual activity, and feeding. And so it is believed that psilocin, through this process of binding and acting like that serotonin at that receptor specifically, that specific subtype, is what's responsible for mediating some of the hallucinogenic properties of these mushrooms. Now, we are hearing increasingly, this is going to be the era of the psychedelics, right? So the last decade has been cannabis. Cannabis was legalized. We've had a lot of discourse around that already. I predict that psilocybin and hallucinogens will become legalized in Canada in the next decade, because increasingly we're seeing their benefits in terms of therapeutic efficacy for things like depression, anxiety, and most importantly, in my field, substance use disorders. And the reason for why, like we know in the 60s, they were doing some research on this. I don't know if you all know this. They were doing some research. Some of it was horrible, and oh yeah, I agree. And ethically, ethically dubious. But because people were fearing that the widespread use of hallucinogens was going to create, a generation of people that were addicted. They were made illegal and were not allowed to be used in research. And now that's changing. So what is the research saying? Well, we talked about the default mode network, which I never have a great explanation. So I'm going to turn to Jim to explain what is the default mode network.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of neuroscience I actually do know. So there's a fairly recently discovered circuit in the brain called the default mode network. And what happens is that it gets activated often when you are doing a task that isn't particularly cognitively engaging. Maybe you're like waiting in line or something like that, or you're doing something that's a little bit boring. And it is the daydreaming, anxiety, and planning, thinking about your values and your future. It's sort of, you go offline from what you're not engaged in the activity in front of you. You're thinking about other stuff. And that's what the default mode network is for. And its activity is inversely correlated with your prefrontal cortex activity. So when one goes up, the other goes down. Mm-hmm. And so that's what it is. So
let's go back to psilocybin and what it does therapeutically. So like I said, it works at that 5-HT2A receptor. And what that seems to do is it activates another neurotransmitter known as glutamate. And glutamate's involved in learning and memory and neuroplasticity. So what we think these agents are doing is they're leading to rapid remodeling of neural circuits. So when we think about what therapy does, and SSRIs or classic antidepressants, what they're doing is working to also, develop new thoughts, new patterns of thinking. And what these psychedelic agents seem to be doing is almost like adding fertilizer to the mix and rapidly remodeling the brain. And what there's some papers now, and I just read there's a new systematic review looking at all the papers that are published looking at the role of psilocybin in addiction recovery, and specifically its role in actually regulating the default mode network. And there is evidence to support that. So neuroimaging studies where they do a pre-post, where people before using psilocybin who have an alcohol use disorder, that's where it's commonly been used, as alcohol use disorders and nicotine use disorder. And then they look at the activity of the brain before treatment and after treatment, and they do see this regulation of of the default mode network. And so specifically, there's an increase in the functional connectivity of the brain. And so this is a really exciting time to be in research and specifically in this space. I want to shout out my colleague, Dr. Leah Mayo, who's the Parker Psychedelic Chair. I mean, who doesn't want that title? At the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. And her whole research program is actually employing or using psychedelic treatment in patients with alcohol use disorder and seeing what the long-term outcome are. And so far, we've got some pretty exciting research. So stay tuned. Watch this space.
You're going to publish with her?
Yeah. So we're going to publish together, and our research, it'll be the Hellmans-Mayo paper. Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to talk, next question is, what are your thoughts on ChatGPT's impact on the academic space? And how do you expect this to evolve? So the ChatGPT and other generative language models are really controversial in academia, meaning that you talk to different professors and different education specialists and everybody, and the opinions on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing or what we should do about it are really all over the place. I am one of the people who thinks that it's generally a bad thing for formal education, although it can be a great thing for informal education. What we do know is that about 90% of students admit to using it to help with their homework, but 70% of students think that they shouldn't be allowed. So it's it is sort of offloading your thinking to someone else. It's really unlike other tools in that you don't have to think as much. I've talked to students who find it very tempting to use it. It's discouraging to use it because what it produces is so impressive. So it is. It's very hard to predict what is going to happen. I think it really depends on what the teachers and professors decide. Some people think we can't fight it. Others say that we have to just resort to medieval methods of doing work with pencils and no computers. I really worry when we have
abacus, maybe.
We have glasses that like have cameras in them, and there's an AI talking to you through bone conduction. I don't know how we'd have to like force students to have a pair of glasses that aren't smart if we wanted to avoid it. So what I think is that its impact on academics is that if people, to the extent that people use it to replace their own thinking, it is going to be detrimental to their learning how to think. And it is, and the problem is that when it's most important to actually think about something is when it's the hardest to figure it out. So when you're just really frustrated, you don't know where to go next, and you just need to like work it out, write, talk to people, brainstorm. That is when these language models are most tempting. And it is also where you're avoiding, I think, the best learning that can happen. The other thing that's interesting, and this is a valid point, is that some people are saying that AI is going to be so ubiquitous in the working world that not only should we let our students use it, we should teach them how to use it. And they will be at a strategic disadvantage if they aren't trained on how to use it. Right now, I don't think that the skill of prompt engineering is so hard to learn that we need to teach it in university. And right now, I think that the drawbacks of teaching students how to do it outweigh the benefits, particularly because when you teach students how to do really good prompt engineering, you're basically telling them how to cheat in other classes. So those are my thoughts.
I'll leave those with Jim. You want to take the next one?
Yeah, sure. Okay. How do extreme conditions like ice baths and saunas affect one's brain and mind? Is the idea of these rituals increasing one's self-discipline, willpower, and related concepts supported by any research? So they've done research on ice baths and cold water immersion, and they've also done research on saunas. So these are both temperature changes, like extreme temperature changes. For ice baths, there seem to be some benefits. It can lead to improved alertness, but there are also some negative effects. So it seems to impair short-term memory, and it seems to make it can increase pain perception, which isn't always good. So it seems to me that ice baths are not a I wouldn't do ice baths to improve your mind. There might be other benefits, like physiological benefits or whatever. But right now, I don't think the research really supports overall that it's good for your mind. Sauna bathing is called. Sauna bathing has been found to relax you and increase some cognitive processing. And there's some preliminary evidence suggesting that it can decrease the chance of dementia. That's some of the research on that. You want to say anything about it?
Well, I was just going to add that a couple things. Number one, so we can look at this through the lens of something known as the stress inoculation theory, which has been advanced by psychologists and neuroscientists to suggest that organisms that are exposed to mild to moderate controllable stressors in their lifetime are better able to combat future stressors because they've been inoculated. And I do think that I would disagree that with Jim saying I don't think it benefits the mind. There is actually some evidence to show that 5 minutes of tipping your face in cold water is one technique that's been used to increase resilience in individuals, much like exercise, right? Anytime you do something where you feel uncomfortable and you push yourself to that limit of uncomfortableness or discomfort, and I want to emphasize, not unsafe, right? You don't want to be sitting in a sauna for like 4 hours, right? Raising your body temperature above what would be normal. But a short amount of time where you are pushing the boundaries of comfort, you're actually training the circuits of your brain that are involved in stress and coping to be better able to cope with stressors in the future. And so all that is to say, it doesn't matter the nature of the stressor, whether it's physical or psychological, you're all working on the same brain mechanism. So if you want to improve your ability to cope with stress, doing cold water baths, saunas, exercise, anything, paced breathing, this has been shown to have benefit. So that's
So as usual, I was thinking about the cognitive effects and not the other stuff. But the part of that question was about willpower, and that training your willpower. Research is all over the place.
Yeah.
There are people who say that you can improve your willpower by doing things that are difficult with like sort of this muscle training metaphor, like brushing your teeth with your non-dominant hand or whatever. But that, I think, came under a lot of fire with the replication crisis. So I'm not really super confident in that research at this point.
But maybe that's being like in the space of coping, like willpower, like, sort of that. Yeah,
like resilience. Resilience, I think, is related, but not the same, quite the same thing as willpower, right? Like being able to deal with stressful situations versus getting yourself to do something difficult,
Sure.
How large an effect can the kind of music you listen to have on your life? Can music be harmful? Okay, so there are a lot of studies that show that there are benefits to listening to music. I just want to say that listening to music while you're doing something cognitive, like studying or something, is usually not a good idea.
What?
Although, it's technically multitasking and not good. But instrumental music is sometimes okay for stuff like programming and this kind of thing. Now, the kind of music you listen to, there doesn't seem to be much of an effect on that. Okay, so people would it's one of these like psych myths that like listening to classical or jazz makes you smarter and listening, whatever. None of that's really true. But the relaxation benefits and the mental well-being benefits, it's the most important thing is that you're listening to music that you actually like. That's the most important thing. There's been some studies showing that actually playing music has some benefits. It's a really different way to use your mind. I took up playing guitar a few years ago, and one of the things I loved about it was that it was so different from the rest of my hobbies and my work, which is mostly sitting at a computer and reading and writing. I was using my body in a different way, and it really feels different. And I think it's in a class of things where using your mind in a very different way helps it stay plastic and expand and that kind of thing. Particularly for older adults, it's playing musical instruments seems to be associated with better cognitive ability, and may slow down some of the age-related effects of reduced cognition.
Okay. OCD?
Okay, how does OCD develop in the brain? I'm going to skip this one.
Okay.
I don't feel like I know enough about it. Do you want to say something about it?
Sure. Or I've got some students from my 1202 class that maybe they can reiterate the CSTC circuit. No.
That's an oral. It's now an oral exam.
All right. So obsessive compulsive disorder is one of the psychiatric conditions that is defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it involves obsessive thoughts and compulsions in order to reduce the obsessive thoughts. So the common one is around issues of like hygiene. I feel dirty. People have fears that they've touched something. They're contaminated. They want to wash their hands, and they end up doing so repeatedly because they can't get rid of the thought that I'm contaminated. So they keep washing their hands to the point where they're, scalding their hands because they're using excessively hot water. So OCD at the root of it is anxiety, right? It is an anxiety-based disorder because it involves these anxious thoughts that you cannot seem to get rid of. And in spite of doing the activity, the motor activity to try to reduce the anxious thought, it keeps going into this loop. So that gives us hints as to what's going on in the brain. So the main area of the brain that's involved in regulating thought is your frontal lobe. So there are specific subdivisions in your frontal lobe and parts of your prefrontal cortex that are involved in regulating your motor output, right? So imagine like I'm thirsty, I reach for a glass of water, I take the glass of water, I drink. And that is what's happening is a circuit, right? I'm thirsty, I reach out, I take the glass of water, I drink, the motor output is done, it's completed, I can now do something else, right? In OCD, you have these anxious thoughts that originate and are in your conscious mind. And what happens is the action of doing the hand washing isn't inhibiting the actual anxious thought. So you're stuck in this loop. So in the brain, we have what are called the cortical striatal thalamic cortical circuits, right? It's literally a loop. You have something originating in your cortex. It gets sent down to your striatum and your thalamus, which are involved in your motor output. And then the motor output is done. It goes back to the cortex that says, I've completed that. And we know that there's lots of rich evidence in the neuroscience literature that CSTC circuit in OCD is dysfunctional. So you have this imbalance in what's called the direct and indirect pathways within this circuit, so that what happens is you have this spiraling anxiety thought that isn't being reduced by the motor output. And so treatments for OCD typically are done to reduce the anxiety, or often in therapy or with serotonin reuptake inhibitors to try to calm the activity of that or return that CSTC circuit back to balance. So that's OCD in a nutshell. I'm going to take the next one too, because it's one of my favorite conversations about caffeine. I see lots of people drinking some coffee or tea here. So how does caffeine dependency affect daily cognitive functioning? Does drinking coffee every morning negatively affect your cognitive functioning? What happens to your cognition if you choose to quit or take a break from caffeine? So even though this is, they're saying cognition here, I'm going to take it as
I'll allow this.
Allowed, sustained. The lawyer's laughing. So what I'll say is that caffeine is actually a stimulant. It's a special class of stimulant, wherein what stimulants will do in the brain and the body is they'll alert you, right? So they sort of act on the neural systems that are involved in engaging the organism, right? So your fight or flight response is an example of that activation of those stimulant systems. And caffeine works on a specific signal in the brain called adenosine. And when adenosine is high, it actually promotes sleepiness. And so caffeine is an adenosine inhibitor, and it blocks that. So it actually promotes wakefulness and alertness. And so the question, does caffeine decrease or negatively affect your cognitive functioning? It's actually the opposite. It's actually quite good. And that's why we take it. And we drink caffeinated beverages or eat caffeinated foods, because they improve our ability to focus and pay attention. But caffeine withdrawal is pretty terrible. And yes, that does affect your cognitive state. So One of the things that caffeine does is it's a vasoconstrictor, so it constricts your blood vessels, makes them really small. And in caffeine withdrawal, it actually does the opposite, so it vasodilates, and those blood vessels, particularly ones that feed your brain, become very, very wide, and that is what is a caffeine headache. And so you feel foggy, you have a headache, you just feel kind of more irritable. And so regular caffeine consumption will actually, if you stop drinking caffeinated beverage for even one day, you will experience these negative cognitive outcomes. But the good news is you can never become tolerant to caffeine. So if just one drink a day will give you that stimulant boost. In very rare cases, there are people who consume lots and lots of caffeinated beverages, and that is actually, we did a whole episode on this. It's not good for you. You can get caffeineism. Your heart rate will go through the roof. You're sweaty. You feel quite a bit of anxiety. And I've heard from some of our residence counselors, in fact, that when they talk to students who are saying, I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety, and they're asking, well, how many caffeinated beverages do you drink a day? And they're like, 8 to 10. And they're like, let's start with that. Let's reduce the caffeine. So there you go.
I've heard that, tell me if you think this is right, that caffeine gives you some benefits, but it's borrowing from the future. Like because of the crash later, like you have to pay the piper eventually. Like do you think that that's accurate? Like if you have caffeine in the morning, that there's a subsequent decrease in performance later in the day, or do you not know about that?
Yeah, maybe for sure. Because by the time it metabolizes, and then you might be more susceptible to that midday slump.
Right, because what it blocks is now all that's unblocked, and there's a backup of it.
Yeah.
So I've read that you should use caffeine strategically, right? Not necessarily all the time, but when you need it, and you can sort of realize that you're borrowing energy from the future or whatever. So
I thought you were like you were going down a very strange path for a minute.
What, borrowing from the future?
I was like, are we? Yeah. What's happening?
Strictly science.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. What are the underlying factors that impact our level of self-efficacy? And how can we work towards increasing our level of self-efficacy? So self-efficacy is your confidence and belief in your own abilities to do things effectively. So it's kind of another word for confidence. Sometimes it's directed toward a specific task. And there is some research on how to improve that. The answer is not super exciting. One of the best ways to make people feel like they're more effective is to have them learn to be more effective. So you have them master certain things, right? So getting someone to master something is a fundamental part of education, right? And it's, a good educator or a good mentor will give simpler tasks early on, and harder tasks later on. And this is, so that there's always a challenge felt, but there's also a lot of reward, right? So you start with the easy problems and you feel good when you do it. Also, they found that the application of technical skills builds self-efficacy feelings. What that means is that, you can learn to do something, but then having students actually use that new skill to effectively do something, maybe in an applied kind of way, brings a lot of feelings of self-efficacy. And there's also a study that could find people's character. There's a survey or a psychological test you could take that finds your character strengths. And people who take this test and the strengths are communicated to them, that seems to improve self-efficacy too. So it's sort of like a self-knowledge, what am I good at kind of thing, seems to help. Okay. Why do we minimize our life experiences, our trauma, and our anxiety? Often I see people going through things, they minimize and say it's not that bad. How can we validate our own concerns and understand it's okay to ask for help? So there's a really interesting literature on this. There's one concept called experiential avoidance, which is where if you've got some fear or something, you don't want it to get triggered, and so what you do is you go through life trying to avoid the things that activate it, and that's sometimes called experiential avoidance. And there is some research to suggest that doing this doesn't really help much in the long term. Even though but in a moment it makes it, you're avoiding distress. So this is sometimes why somebody might do it. Why somebody might minimize trauma when they're talking to their friends or something, I'm not even sure that happens a lot. I couldn't find any research showing how often it happens. Personally, I know people who seem like they're minimizing something that would be traumatic. And I know other people who just seem to make a really big deal out of little things. So I don't know if there's a trend either way. But there could be some like communication issues there, right? Like they might not want to be thought of as that person who is, they don't want to be like thought of as the person who went through this trauma and that's all they know about it. Like if both your parents were murdered, that's pretty significant, and you don't want to be like, oh, that's the student who's with the dead parents, right? So, that might be like a reason to minimize it.
That was a grim example.
I'm trying to think of trauma on the fly. I guess wow. I'm sorry, your kids were killed. Okay, so
even worse.
But there are other studies though that show that like redirecting your mind when you're having like negative thoughts or whatever, practicing redirecting your mind to more pleasant things actually is beneficial. So I think this is a really complex thing, as all kind of therapy-based and psychiatric interventions are. People are very complex. Sometimes the nuances of how it's done matters a lot, and it's a complex area of research. I'll also say that when it's okay to ask for help, right? I've seen in my lifetime a big change in the lessening of stigma for having mental health problems. A lot of more people are willing to talk about it, willing to seek help, and I think we still have a ways to go, but I think I've seen some really nice improvements. I think that something else that doesn't get quite as much attention is the idea of building resilience in people too. And in an effort to encourage people to seek help and stuff, again, it's one of these nuanced things where I think there is sometimes a danger of putting them in a victim mindset, which can take away autonomy and this kind of thing. So that is probably a book-length subject. So, but those are some of my thoughts on it.
So speaking of stigma, the last question from our participants: how can we as members of society help to reduce stigma pertaining to mental health or substance use disorders? It's especially challenging when old, outdated beliefs about these topics persist, which create stigma and barriers for those struggling. What are some things that we can do to make an impact both in the present and in the future to be part of the change? So great question. And in fact, my PhD student is here in the audience, who that's her dissertation research is. There's Denise, who is she's going to be studying this in the context of substance use disorders and looking at stigmatized attitudes and beliefs as they relate to people who use substances. And I would say, for sure, the number one thing that we can all do to reduce stigma as it relates to substance use and mental health is to change the language that we use when we talk about people who have mental health conditions or who use substances. For those of you that have had me as a professor, you know very well this is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart, working very much in allyship with people with lived experience with mental health and substance use disorders. And this is very much the call to action from that community is how we talk about people who use substances. And you notice I talk in that way. I use person first language as opposed to identity first language. So I don't refer to people as addicts. That is stigmatizing language. I refer to people who use substances or a person with a substance use disorder. So definitely the language that we use, how we talk about it really makes a difference. And I always feel that part of my learning outcomes in any class that I teach is empowering students to have conversations with people around them, to be able to know how to talk about it, and also to call people in. So there's a difference between calling somebody out. I can't believe that you called that person an alcoholic. Then calling somebody in and saying, hey, just so you know, the preferred term that we use when we talk about somebody who has an alcohol use disorder is this person has an alcohol use disorder. disorder. So you bring them in a loving, compassionate way, and through that, I do think that we are going to be the systems of change, right? As my dear friend Gore Gardner always says, women won the right to vote because men showed up to vote them in. So we as allies in that community, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves around mental health and to also have conversations in that positive, compassionate way with our loved ones, with our friends and family members. And that truly is going to be the thing that makes a difference when we think about stigma and mental health and substance use disorders, because stigma is the number one barrier preventing people from seeking help. And we see that in men. Right? Men are far less likely to seek help when they are struggling, and that turns into very dire statistics in terms of men being more likely to die by suicide. We see that in racialized folks from gender LGBTQS communities, folks that are differently abled. Anybody in those equity-owed groups are the ones that are far less likely to seek support, because they're also the stigma is perpetuated in the systems of healthcare. So again, I call on you all to work on your allyship. You can be the oppressed and the oppressor. I am a cis-het white woman with no diagnosed mental health disorder, but at the same time, I can consider myself somebody who has racist or oppressive tendencies because of the systems that I've grown up in. So it's constantly doing the work and educating yourself that I think is truly the way forward.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks.
It was a lot of fun, and thank you for your questions.